Hi, everyone. Welcome to My Weight Live. Tonight, we're here with Dr. Michael Lyon talking about what he calls a reality based weight loss approach. And I'm so excited to announce that we're going to do something really special tonight. Everyone who leaves a comment or a question for us is going to get our free Build a Healthy Breakfast PDF. If you're looking for some fresh inspiration on the most important meal of the day, you're in luck. Dr. Lyon, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Oh, it's a great pleasure to be with you again.
We have so much that we want to cover with you, but most importantly, we want to hear from you guys and the audience. We have the great good fortune of a world-renowned weight expert here talking with us. What questions do you have for him? We want to see them in the comments. But we'll start with my questions. So, Dr. Lyon, it's still January, so no surprise, my first question for you is about resolutions. We often set these really ambitious resolutions for ourselves at the beginning of the year, and in a way, we're kind of setting ourselves up to fail. So, first question, what do you wish people knew about setting health goals? And if someone could focus on one thing, what would you suggest it be?
Well, I think it's human nature that people underestimate what they could do in a long period of time, and they greatly overestimate what they can do in a short amount of time. So, New Year's
Interesting.
resolutions, that's a great example. You set these kind of over the top resolutions to make these huge changes, often that involve a lot of um, deprivation and pain. And
It's true.
fail to make these huge changes, then you go right back to where things were. The problem is that's not how great things are accomplished. Great things are accomplished by doing a little bit of something that you have the knowledge, the strength, and the enthusiasm to do, and you build upon the success of that small change. And over time, it accumulates to something much, much bigger. And so great companies are built that way. People who make huge changes in their health and their life with their weight, they do it that way. They do it with these small changes that are captivating the real human nature, and that is that we hate pain and we hate being deprived of something, and we're creatures of habit. And to form a new habit that's a very different direction, you've got to go about it in a very careful, almost stealthy kind of way to trick your body gradually into doing something that initially it really doesn't want to do.
All right, so I want to say hello to a couple folks who've said hello to us in the comments. I want to say hello to Carol in Pennsylvania, hi to Terry, and hi to Maddie, the wonderful moderator of our Facebook group. Okay, so you've said some really interesting things here that I want to dive into. You said that there are really kind of two opposite dynamics happening. On the one hand, we underestimate what we can accomplish in the long run, but we overestimate what we can accomplish in the short run. So the way I might think about is making smaller goals in the short term with the idea that that it is possible to make big changes in the long run. Is that what I hear you saying?
Yeah, take for example, the average, I'm pretty sure it's the same in the US, but the average Canadian watches 6 to 7 hours of television a day. And I just think, what if dedicated, instead of 6 or 7, that's television and other forms of screens, you might say,
Screen time.
screen time. But if you would dedicate, say, 2 hours a day to doing something good for you that you could make enjoyable, like, say, learning to cook wholesome foods, if you did that on a daily basis, you could become a completely different person in a couple of years. I think back when I was the team doctor for one of Canada's Olympic teams, and we took this team from 26th to winning a gold medal in Lillehammer, Norway, over the course of a couple of years. And
Wow.
I think these were people that weren't getting paid at the time. They had other jobs, but they trained an average of 6 hours a day. I think of it, the average Canadian watches TV for 6 hours a day, an amount of time you could become a gold winning Olympic athlete if you're really focused.
Well,
So,
that's
so
such a yeah, that's such a great analogy because it's like, the small changes that you make, if you can dedicate the time to them, you have no idea what you can accomplish. Gold medals
exactly.
included.
You could, not saying you have to do away with screen time, but if you were to set aside even say, like half an hour a day just to focus on something healthy that you're not doing now, like say going for a walk. And you were sedentary before that, and now you're just doing half an hour a day, or maybe even say 15 minutes.
hmm
You do it every single day. It would transform your life. And over the course of years, when we see people who have revolutionized their life, who've gotten to a lower weight and they're just loving a new healthy lifestyle, they've done it by dedicating a little bit of time to doing something new that's good for them every day. And those little steps add up to be really the course of a big journey over time.
Oh, okay. I love everything about that. And we're gonna come back to that. I want to say hi to Sandra in Alberta. Hi to Connie. And Maddie says, I'm totally guilty of too much screen time. I'm working on that this year. And it's funny because of all the health resolutions I've heard people talk about, less screen time isn't one I've heard. So I think that's a really good insight that, it's almost shifting the time that we're already dedicating to something else, maybe to walking, for example, or cooking, or, those kind of goals.
Yeah, and I think even if you start by, and again, I'm not inclined to say give up screen time
Mm-hmm.
because none of you can, but if you even start to change the nature of your screen time a little bit. So, for example, I would never get on a treadmill if it didn't have a television in front of it. I don't watch a lot of television, but I've found that I can start a series on, say, Netflix. And if I know the only time I kind of give myself permission to watch that show is when I'm on my treadmill, man, the time goes by when you're watching a show on Netflix. I watched all of Breaking Bad. I
Wow.
started from season one, went through the whole thing. And boy, I got a lot of great tread.
and was
Yeah.
and was very entertained as well. So actually that leads me to my next question, which I was going to say, I am very guilty of doing these big grand goals like no sugar for the month of January, and they always end up backfiring on me, which is why I think you're saying don't say something like no screen time. Talk a little bit about why deprivation just doesn't work in the long run, and how in fact it can sometimes lead to the opposite of what we want.
Well, it's, human beings we have this little accountant in our heads, kind of like the bean counter for dopamine signals. And every day, for you to feel like your life is complete and that day was complete, you have to have had a certain amount of these pleasurable dopaminergic signals turned on within certain areas of the brain.
Wow.
These are what we call rewards. These are neurological rewards, and every human being needs a certain amount in order to feel like your life is worth living,
Hmm.
essentially.
Okay.
And so you start to scale back things that give you dopaminergic rewards that maybe are not good for you. Maybe they're, too much drinking alcohol. Maybe it's, the wrong kinds of snack foods. You have to be prepared that if you don't find some way to fill in the dopamine neurons with something else that's going to be good for you, that you're going to go back to that old habit. There's no way around it.
Wow.
It's sort of like holding your breath. Anybody can hold their breath with willpower. It's really easy, it's so easy, like anybody can do it. Well, that can only go on for so long because there's other forces
Eventually.
at work that will insist that you breathe again. Well, likewise, there's centers within the brain that control your food intake and do a very good job of that. And fortunately so, because if you didn't eat enough, you would die very soon. You'd be better off eating a bit too much than not eating enough.
Hmm.
Anorexia nervosa has a higher 5-year mortality than coronary heart disease. So we know
Wow.
that's not good for us.
Right.
But on the other hand, if you want to get your weight under control, you've got to work with the system that's there. You've got to work with your wiring. You've got to accept certain realities. If you're a comfort eater and you eat because you need food for comfort, realize that's what food is for. It's for comfort. And food is for pleasure. It's for social occasions. It's for all of that. And you've got to find a healthy way to put that into balance. You can't just eliminate the pleasure. If you think you can get your weight under control when you have a weight problem and you maybe have some disorderly eating habits by
Hmm.
skipping meals once a week, the fast 2 days, eat five
Right.
idea,
Hmm.
it's, for the average person that wants to drop a few pounds, maybe, but for the typical person who's struggling with a serious weight problem, it's not a good idea. It really isn't. What you're doing is you're taking someone with disorderly eating patterns, typically,
Hmm.
often eating disorder, maybe like binge eating disorder,
Hmm.
perhaps, or food
Hmm.
addictions, and you're just giving them another disorderly eating pattern to adopt,
Ah.
and it's really not going to help in the long run. It really isn't. And to some extent, I'm not just babbling about this or even reflecting on science. I'm talking from the voice of experience because I grew up a heavy kid. I tried to solve my weight problems so many different ways. The only thing that really worked was when I got sick bad enough I almost died, and I ended up losing a lot of weight. But when I
Wow.
was trying to keep the weight off, I tried everything under the sun. One of my favorite things was fasting. And this is not some new thing. This was back in the 70s. I used to skip one day a week and just drink water, and then do these juice fasts for 2 weeks, or master cleansers. And I even did a 21-day water fast, no food at all
Wow.
for 21 days.
Oh my
And
gosh.
yeah, I lost, like, I don't know how you could do this, but I lost 35 pounds. Then I gained 75 pounds in the next year.
And that's the cycle that I know so many folks in our audience can relate to and have been on. So we actually have so many comments here. Ian says, "Hi, Ian, one of our favorite folks. He works with Obesity Canada." He says,
Yeah.
"Dopamine speaks to the transfer addiction issues many of us have." So let's come back and talk about that. But I have to tell you, Dr. Lyon, Linda says, "Thanks so much. Dr. Lyon's talks always keep me going on my weight loss journey." And I know for me too, I love hearing what you have to say. So thank you very much. Lillian also says, "I'm totally with you on treadmill and TV." And I want to say hi to Bridget and hi to Betty. So let's go back to this question of dopamine. And you're saying, we have to build rewards into our day. We can't just strip it all out and think that our body's not going to, our body and our brains aren't going to rebel. How could someone think about structuring those rewards differently, to kind of taking a new approach to it?
Well, to some extent, it gets to the basics of how we should eat. Like in
Mm-hmm.
our culture, we've learned to gobble down our meals and go. Uh, that's part of the problem, is that you have these very sensual foods that taste great for a few seconds, then they're gone. And yeah, it does light up the dopamine brain centers, but it does it with way too many calories. And
Right.
I think a better approach is to truly learn to be mindful when you eat, to not to enjoy your food less, but to learn to savor your food far more than you ever have. To when you're eating, there should be nothing in your universe except what's in your mouth. You should enjoy no matter what it is. You should try to get every molecule of pleasure out of that food. And that is something that needs to be cultivated. It's not something you can do overnight.
It takes
It
practice.
does take practice, and to some extent, I think some of it is kind of pre-wired. Like if you're a person that doesn't chew slowly and swallows quickly and eats fast, I think it's almost like something you were born that
Right.
way.
Yes.
It's not an easy thing to overcome, but you
Right.
can become more mindful, and you can stop and slow down and eat your meals with more focus on that moment, rather than just kind of gobble down your food.
Well, so I'm so glad you're talking about this because in a lot of ways, I think, when you're struggling with weight, the idea that I should enjoy food more seems a little counterintuitive. So I'm so glad we're talking about this. So what you're saying is really, no matter what you're eating, really take the time, eliminate distractions, no TV, no phone, really be there, enjoy it fully, be fully present with it. And that alone will give your brain that kind of that dopamine reward that it's looking for. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, as much as it is possible. I
Mhm.
mean, we
Mhm.
live such big lives that the peril comes when you're so busy you can't stop and savor a nice meal, but you skip a meal instead. Now, that's
Mm.
not a good either. So I would rather a person has a meal replacement shake, for instance, or make a smoothie and just, get it down and go, if it means that you don't skip a meal. Because that's the second thing is, if you really want to control your weight and your appetite, you have to understand that eating with regularity is definitely going to be one of the key elements. And
Not letting
get
yourself get too hungry.
yeah, you have to think about appetite like a monster that you have to tame. You don't
Mhm.
starve a monster. If you want to keep it tame, you feed it regularly, you feed it well, and it's less likely to be the one that's in charge. So I've as a person who I'm 60 now, and I have struggled with weight all my life. I was the heaviest kid in the city of Estevan, Saskatchewan, growing up, and now I'd say that I've adopted a number of really important policies. One of which is that I fear hunger greatly. I don't ever want to feel more than the very beginnings of that feeling without doing something about it. It
Mhm.
means that if I delay responding to hunger with something appropriate where I'm in control, then later I'm likely going to respond by overeating or making a wrong choice and eating with less control or perhaps no control.
That's such a good point, and I think sometimes many of us think, well, I just have no willpower, but maybe it's that we haven't put ourselves in a position to have, to have the, I hate to use the word control, but to make the healthy choices that we really do want to make. Sometimes when we're just that hungry, we don't have a lot of choice. Our body just wants what it needs at that moment.
Yeah. I mean, I look at myself as a very, I guess, relatively lazy and undisciplined individual who has almost no willpower. People will think, well, how can you do this? You're a doctor and you seem to have a pretty successful life, and you're happily married to the same person for 35 years. What have you
What's
must
your
be some.
secret? Yeah.
Well, it's that I guess I tripped upon some very simple principles that I just kind of stick with. And one of them, when it comes to my weight and my eating habits, is that I've learned that hunger is an enemy that must be kept at bay. It's a pretty simple principle, but if you really continually invoke that principle and you are good at that, it makes it really easy to make better choices. So I just simply almost never ever skip a meal. If I do, I'll pay the price. I learned long ago that fasting is not a good way for me to keep my weight under control. I was really good at it.
Hmm.
Uh, I felt very little hunger when I was fasting, but I learned that my body would ask for payback.
There's
It
a
was like,
price to be paid later. Yeah.
yeah, skipping meals to lose weight or even fasting is kind of like borrowing from a loan shark. You borrow calories, and then your body wants those calories back with big time interest.
Interest. Oh, that's such a
And,
great analogy.
and it reflects in the way that the physiology works. When you
Hmm.
fast, your metabolism goes down acutely. Your body doesn't need as many calories because your body will sense starvation and it will quickly respond by reducing metabolism. And then when you do finally eat later, you're eating in a milieu where your brain is flooded with hormones like ghrelin that surge to a level that makes it irresistible not to eat more than you should. And I mean, if you want to know what is binge eating disorder, which is really a very common eating disorder we see,
Hmm.
it's a where people have extreme control followed by a complete loss of control. The most important fact in binge eating disorders, when people begin to eat during a binge, it's not broccoli, first of all. It's usually a food that is not so good, like potato chips or something similar.
Hmm.
And then they eat with a sense that they've lost all control, that there's almost like something inside of them that's taken over, like a robotic system that's driving them to just keep shoveling the chips in their mouth till the whole bag is gone or they feel ill. And
Hmm.
that's really a person who's got such control that they can diet or skip meals or fast even. And then when they finally do um, get to that point where they've exhausted that strong control, then they lose all control.
Wow.
So it's far better to find a moderate place. I think so many people, those of us who've been struggling with our weight, tend to be these all or nothing kind of people. You're either on a diet or you're not on a diet. Well, it's far better to think of this as a lifelong journey. Like, just keep thinking of it that way, because it is, first of all,
Hmm.
and pace yourself so that you're not going to tackle a change in your behavior that's not something that you, first of all, hopefully will enjoy. Like, very little of what's going to be successful are things that are not enjoyable.
Absolutely. Yes.
If you want to be on a diet, you better darn well enjoy it, or you're not going to be able to really incorporate that into your lifestyle long term. So that applies especially to diets based on lots of rules or deprivation. Like, no matter how scientifically valid the low carb, high fat ketogenic diet is, which it
Hmm.
is, lots of
Hmm.
science behind it, many respects, as far as having advantages for weight loss. The problem is that very few people can adhere to it long term.
For the long run.
Yeah, people lose satisfaction with the diet. At a certain point, they start to really crave those carbs again.
Sure. So I want to go back to this all or nothing mentality that you hit on, because I mean, I'm guilty of it. I think it's almost ingrained in our society. It's either do it perfectly or not at all. And one
Mhm.
of my favorite people that we've done interviews with, she was in Toronto. She talked about doing a road trip from Toronto to Florida, and how this all or nothing mentality is like, doing the road trip, you're on your road trip, you get to South Carolina and you make a wrong turn. And the all or nothing mentality is like saying, I have to go back to Toronto and get to Florida perfectly, when really you can just adjust, get back on track and keep heading to Florida. You don't have to just throw the baby out with the bathwater. How do you counsel people to begin kind of moving away from that all or nothing mentality and think about, what am I going to do when maybe I fall short of my goal for the day? How do you recommend that people readjust their sails and embrace, that was a day that didn't go the way I wanted. What am I going to do next?
Well, these things can have very deep roots and go back to your origins as a child, when you have someone whose environment was harsh, or parents were sort of pushing you to always do your best. And best was never maybe quite good enough.
Yes.
Perfectionism arises from these kinds of environments, I think, or maybe they are pre-wired in some of us. And to get to a place in your life where you realize that good enough is good enough. And the idea of doing your best isn't even necessarily a good thing to strive for, because if you're a perfectionist, doing your best
it's never.
No. I worked with Olympic athletes for years and professional athletes, and realized, these people, perfection is the only option, right? If you're an Olympic athlete, the only thing you really want is a gold medal. And if you get a gold medal, now you want to have a collection of them. And it's tough. It's a tough life to be a perfectionist by profession. There are some professions where I'm grateful that the surgeon is a perfectionist, or the airline pilot. At least in those environments, that's an important thing. But on the other hand, when you're applying that to you in everything in your life, it's just impossible. And it's easy to get weary of yourself and your failures when you are always striving for perfection. So teaching people to have empathy for themselves, to accept compromise, to realize that in most everyone's life, most of what you do, you're going to be kind of mediocre at it. And that's okay. It's good enough to be good enough.
Yes.
And even in the thing you want to do the most, I guess you've got to accept a certain amount of compromise. Like for me, I grew up a heavy kid. I've been thinner in the past. I usually gain, it just seems like the way it is. Every winter I gain maybe some winters I don't gain so much, but I usually gain around 10 pounds, maybe 15. I think my record's 20. And then you wake up one day and your belt doesn't even have another notch left. Oh, not again. And after a while, instead of beating yourself up, you have to realize that it's kind of the way it is. And weight loss for a period of time is going to be, well, I can speak right now. It's going to be my reality.
Right.
I'm there again, it's the belt notch. I've almost got to the last one again. So I have to be working on weight loss again for a few weeks coming up here. And it's tough. I hate it, but it's just one of those things you have to accept that it is what it is. That as you get older, it gets harder, and it doesn't mean giving up and doing all or nothing. It just means that you accept a certain amount of imperfection, because that's the way it is. And you try to do as much as you can within your strength. And
accept,
for me,
where it's not working out.
Yeah. And try as you might. If you're a person prone to weight gain tends to happen. It's really interesting. We've been focusing in terms of the risk of obesity from genetics. We've been looking to try to find the genes that actually program a person to gain weight. And we found for severe weight gain. But now, just actually last week, it was published. There was researchers out of Oxford University in the UK that discovered that the genes for skinny are actually the genes that you can really find in people who are skinny.
Oh, interesting.
About 1/3 of the population that's not yet classified with obesity or overweight, they happen to have a selection of genes that make it so they're programmed to be slim.
Wow.
It's actually the slim genes that are
easier to find.
The default state is obesity in an obesogenic environment. We live in this obesogenic environment. Most of us are programmed for obesity, or for at least overweight, the majority. And it's only the minority that are programmed to remain skinny in the obesogenic environment.
Wow.
Aren't they lucky? And I'm
Yeah.
not one. Nobody in my family is or was that are still alive.
Wow. So we've gotten some really, really, really amazing comments in here. Kelly says the all or nothing mentality is like believing perfection is real. It's all about mastery and allowing grace on yourself when you fall short, and allowing yourself to reset your sails. So Kelly, those are beautiful words and so true. Debbie says, "Why can I do so well with healthy eating for months and then I just lose it? Why don't those habits form for the long term?" What would you say to Debbie? I think that's such a great question and one that all of us can relate to.
I I believe for a long time that when it comes to achievement, it isn't talent or IQ or those kinds of things,
Hmm.
even money at times that determine success. It's stubbornness, persistence.
Grit.
Um, I often think of the metaphor of how a musician learns a new piece. My wife is a violinist. We started going out when she's 16. She started playing when she was 4, so she was really good by that time. But when she practices a new piece, I usually make sure for the first while during practices, I get the dog out for walks and stay away because there's lots of squeaking and squawking that goes on. And one of the keys to success, as a musician, is to accept failure as a normal thing. You
Mm.
practice, you fail, you practice, you fail, you practice, you fail, and eventually you nail it, and it sounds wonderful. And then it's that it's going to come. When it comes to challenging, difficult behaviors in your life, it's very much like that. You have to realize that when you're trying to develop, especially a new habit or a routine in your life that's different than your current habit or routine, it's it's really you're wanting to program new circuitry in your brain. You're wanting to change the structure of your brain itself. And the only way you're going to do that successfully is to repeat the good behavior, fail, repeat the good behavior, fail, repeat the good behavior, fail, like a musician learning to play a new piece.
And there's
So
not
only
the expectation that you're going to get it right the first time if for a
no
musician.
realize that
Yeah.
the way the body is going to work, it's going to fight back at you
Hmm.
and you're going to fail. You're going to go off track and you're going to get discouraged. You're going to lose your strength and your motivation. And then at some point in time, if you haven't written yourself off completely, you're going to realize that the strength will come to do it again. And I'm an open book. I can tell you, I haven't figured it out myself. I certainly have seen some of my most troubling behaviors largely a thing of the past. I used to be a really serious ice cream holic. I had I'm sure, a binge eating disorder when I was younger. And
Hmm.
my biggest struggle was ice cream. I used to eat it until I was physically ill almost every day of the week. And I had a lot of years where I was kind of like an alcoholic with ice cream. And if it ever ended up in the house, I'd polish off the whole container oftentimes, especially if it had chocolate in it of any
Hmm.
kind, peanut butter or anything crunchy or chunky. And that went on for many years. And, it was maybe 25 years ago that I had a real ice cream binge. I thought I had pretty well beat it.
Hmm.
And then this Christmas, my wife sent me out to get ice cream. She had baked some fresh pie for the family who was coming over for a dinner. And the logical thing would be to get just vanilla
Hmm.
that would fit the pie. But I decided I saw the chunky chocolate peanut butter or something or other, and I brought it home and thinking, yeah, I'll have one meal with that and I'll be good. And I did, and I was good for that meal. But then I looked in the freezer. I don't know it might have been a state of mind, or maybe I was really tired or something, but I saw that ice cream. I sat down and I had a bit of it, and then I had a big bowl of it. Then I polished off the whole thing, like basically a pint. And I hadn't done that for years. But, like an alcoholic, if you think you beat it, you say, I'm not an alcoholic, instead of having this more humble attitude that you're in recovery,
Right.
then you're probably, it's the circuit's still there for that ice cream addiction.
I so thank you so much for being so honest, because I think there are a lot of people out there who are saying, yes, this I understand, and that you have been as successful as you've been, and like you said, 25 years can pass, and yet it can change. And so again, the importance of being kind to ourselves and recognizing we do the best we can, but sometimes despite our success, despite all our best efforts, it may not go the way we want it to go.
Yep. But to maintain a general sense of stubbornness, you're going to, I
Stick
wouldn't
to
say
it.
beat this thing, but you're
Yeah.
going to continue to work this program you're going to continue to walk this journey towards a healthier you. And you're going to just resolve that no matter what happens, whether you have a setback or a failure, or you really, really blow it, you regain a bunch of weight, that you're still not going to give up.
You're
You're
not
going
going to
to
give up.
still come back, and you're going to try to work it again and work it again. And if you keep doing it, like the violin player, the number of times you blow it will get less. The circuits in the brain will start to form with new patterns and new habits.
Yeah.
Your taste buds will open up to enjoy a new world of rich flavors and things that you maybe didn't like at all before.
Oh, I love that.
The richness of flavor in whole foods is really extraordinary, but at first your body doesn't even like the taste at all. When you're used to eating, especially, out of a package or a can, or eating at fast food restaurants, it takes a long time to get accustomed to eating healthier foods. And it's something, again, you have to keep exposing your brain to flavors over and over again until the circuits form that connect to the pleasure centers. And you can eventually learn to enjoy even some really odd flavors. A good example is I used to have to go, I did quite a bit of research work with people in Japan. And I used to go to Japan quite regularly. And every time I went, I wanted to learn to like something they call natto, which is soybeans fermented with slime mold. And it's exactly scientifically called slime mold. And you pick this stuff up with chopsticks, and you can go up about 4 feet, and there's still a string of slime that goes down. And it tastes like something that really you don't think that you would be able to live through eating food poisoning. It tastes so weird. But I eat a little bit of it every day for breakfast, because that's when you have a chance to eat natto. And it took me 2 trips of eating it every day. And then I finally went back for the next trip, I thought, well, I'm going to give it one more try. I'm going to eat natto every day and see if I can learn to like it. The first time it went in my mouth, I was like, wow, I really like this. So somehow my brain, while I was away, it sort of computed all the different complex flavors within this strange food. And it eventually made a connection to the pleasure center that said, you now like this. It's the weirdest thing.
Well,
you could actually learn to like something that even tastes like it's like some sort of piece of a rotting beast or something.
Well, that gets back to what you were saying at the beginning. We overestimate what we think we can do in the short term, but we underestimate what we can do in the long term. And changing our taste buds, getting ourselves used to, less salt, or, enjoying an apple rather than apple pie. That can happen. It takes time, and you have to be patient and persevere. But, in the long run, you can get used to new eating habits. And I think that's such a message of hope. So Betty, speaking of your persevering, Betty says, I crochet for a hobby. I've received many compliments on my, quote, talent. She says, it ain't talent, it's tenacity, and that I've got. I'm trying to apply that tenacity to the subject at hand. So we have a couple questions here. Pat says, when your B12 is insufficient, does it affect your weight? And Amy says, I'm also very curious about that, as I have a B12 deficiency. So let's take a little bit of a right turn and talk about B12. And does a deficiency in B12 affect your weight?
Yeah, it certainly can. B12, once it becomes significantly deficient, has a very remarkable effect on the whole nervous system, including the brain. And so initially it could lead to fatigue and depression. It could lead to cognitive changes, and it can lead to eventually, some really serious neurological harm. So it used to be considered, even, it's kind of funny, if you watch Downton Abbey, there's an episode where one of the characters is diagnosed with a terminal illness called pernicious anemia. And it wasn't until, I guess, fairly recently that we realized that pernicious anemia, which cause anemia, but also serious damage to the nervous system and brain, would result eventually in death. It was a terminal illness till they discovered vitamin B12. And then it was a deficiency in B12. Now, that can come about not from a lack of it in your diet, but from a lack of something your stomach has to make to absorb it, called intrinsic factor. Now, to overcome B12 deficiency, you may have to take it in a supplement form. Initially, we used to think you'd have to get it by injection, but now we know if you take a big enough dose, even if you don't make intrinsic factor, you'll absorb enough through the mucosa of the mouth and stomach to still absorb it, to overcome it. Can it contribute to weight gain? I'd say, yeah, indirectly, because if something makes you more fatigued, or if it makes you feel more depressed or cognitively off, then sure, that could contribute to obesity, but not by changing your metabolism. It's
Got
not
it.
something that really affects metabolism directly or appetite directly that we're aware of.
So taking those supplements, if you know you're deficient in B12, very important for
Yeah,
giving you more energy and things like that, that can then
yeah,
aid with weight. Excellent.
that's right. Yeah, yeah,
So we've talked a lot about being kind to ourselves, and I want to play a video now. This is probably my favorite video that we've created. It's one of several different people with obesity and several physicians, including you, Dr. Lyon, and you're talking about why shame and blame just don't work when it comes to managing weight. And we spent a lot of time being kind to ourselves. So we'll play that video now and then come back and talk about it with you.
Fat shaming exists in medicine. It's pervasive, it's permanent, and it's personal.
I have never seen a person, including myself, grow or change constructively, motivated by shame, guilt, and harsh judgment. Nobody flourishes in that environment.
Shame and blame is not helpful because shame and blame has never been helpful. When has that ever worked for anybody to change their views in the long term?
Blaming and shaming doesn't work because people living with obesity feel it every day. And if blame fixed it, I would be the skinniest person you ever saw. That's why it doesn't work.
And in fact, that if an individual wants to be successful with their weight management, they need to start by loving who they are right now, by accepting who they are right now, by making sure they celebrate any small changes that they make that are headed in the right direction health-wise, and that they really practice empathy for themselves. In the end, I think that freedom from this guilt and shame is going to be one of the greatest keys to success in someone who really gets a handle on their weight problem.
Exists everywhere in our society, and unfortunately sometimes in medicine. And I'm sure there are folks in the audience watching tonight who've had that experience of being shamed for their weight in the doctor's office and elsewhere. So I guess my question for you, Dr. Lyon, is for a person with obesity or excess weight, what should they do when they feel like they're being shamed for their weight by their physician and perhaps not getting the care or treatment that they need because of the bias that exists out there?
Well, I would say, first of all, that it's time for people who struggle with their weight to stand up and to assert themselves. It would be good to maybe look at what efforts are being made to collectively say that is no longer appropriate and to support those kinds of movements, because it's no more appropriate to shame someone for their weight than it is to shame them because of their sexual orientation or their race or any of those kinds of things.
Absolutely.
We need to make it politically incorrect. And one of the easiest ways to do it, if you're talking about a healthcare professional, is to give that individual a heads up that that's inappropriate. And perhaps consider fairly early on in the process to filing a formal complaint. I mean, I'd hate to say that because we're talking about my colleagues, but I have to say that some of the most atrocious comments that I've heard have come from healthcare professionals. Doctors may be at the top of the list, nurses a close second. And oftentimes these are comments made thinking that somehow it's motivating someone.
Yes.
Or using the weight as a lever to force them to change. And I don't think that that's ever appropriate. Now, there are safety concerns. I mean, sometimes surgery has to be postponed because of weight, because of safety, but oftentimes surgeons are often at fault by setting arbitrary BMI targets for weight because they think somehow they tell the patient, I'm not going to replace your knee until your BMI is 30. That's somehow magically going to make the patient change. And it's not evidence-based and it's not appropriate. And it just yells bigotry to me.
I'm so glad to hear you say that, because I think it's that same logic. If I'm mean to myself, it'll be easier to change, that we use on ourselves. And that's just not true for all the reasons that you talk about in the video. And so, yes, I think you're right. I'm so glad to hear you say it's time to challenge those perspectives of people who are shaming and blaming folks for their weight. It's just time to say that that's unacceptable.
Yeah.
I cannot
Be
believe.
assertive.
Go ahead. Yeah. Be assertive.
Just be assertive.
Yeah.
Like say then and there, that's not appropriate. That's really not appropriate for you to say that. Did you not realize that that's not appropriate? I would just come right out and say it. It's time that healthcare professionals hear it. Stop them in their tracks. Fat shaming is no longer acceptable. They ought to know it. And if they don't, put them on the spot.
You've heard it from Dr. Lyon here first. Change is now, and it really starts with all of us. That's how social movements happen. I cannot believe how quickly the time has gone. We're already at 30 minutes. I did want to ask you one question. Ian said this, and I really am curious to hear your perspective on this. He said, speaking of hunger, I've spoken to many bariatric patients who post-op find they have uncontrollable hunger or food drive 3 to 4 years out. Any thoughts on managing that? And I know that is a real question for folks.
Yeah. Although bariatric surgery is like a miracle for most people, and they have often remarkable improvements in their health and generally lose a great deal of weight, it doesn't mean the struggle is now over forever. And if you're not careful, 2-3 years out, oftentimes people can start to regain weight, sometimes a lot of weight. The body will start fighting back again. Maybe never quite so much as it did before. If you look at the long-term data on bariatric surgery, especially the bypass, it still looks very, very good many, many years out compared to what it would have been without the surgery. That being said, I think that increasingly we're coming to a realization that for some people, they may need to revisit potentially some medication for helping their appetite later on.
Absolutely. Dr. Lyon, thank you so much for sharing your valuable time with us tonight. We know your clinic is super busy, so we're so appreciative of you taking the time to share your wisdom and answer the questions from our audience. I have about 10 questions I didn't even get to, so we'll have to have you on again. But as always, I leave our conversation inspired and really encouraged that I can be kind to myself on this journey, and anything is possible.
Great. I'm always happy to be part of this.
Thank you so much. Well, folks, that is our show for you tonight. I hope you enjoyed it. I know I've learned a lot. We will be coming back to you live next month on February 25th at 8 p.m. Eastern Time with Dr. Laura Reardon talking about what has been proven to work for managing weight in the long run. I hope you will be able to join us then and get those questions ready. Thank you so much for joining us, and good night.